Have you ever seen a photograph that seemed to breathe, one that held not just an image, but a pulse of emotion that refused to fade? Tonight's story begins with such a photograph. Taken in 1904 inside a children's hospital, it shows a nurse cradling a lifeless child, her face serene, her arms steady, her eyes filled with something between sorrow and devotion. For decades, no one knew their names. Until a young archivist uncovered the truth behind that haunting image. What began as a study of early medical photography slowly unraveled into a tale of compassion that defied the limits of life itself, a story where one woman's quiet act of love reshaped the very meaning of care. So as you settle in, let the room grow still. We'll trace the faint threads between life and death, memory and mercy, and discover how one photograph taken more than a century ago could hold a heartbeat that never truly stopped. Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy History Tales, Boston 2025. The steady sound of rain falling on the windows of the children's hospital made the archives room breathe a different rhythm, slow, deep, and hazy. At an old wooden table in the middle of the room, curator Olivia Reeves carefully peeled layers of preservation paper from a box of old photos that had just been excavated. The hospital was about to celebrate its 150th anniversary, and the historic inventory had accidentally awakened many things that had seemed forgotten in the dark. Boxes of documents that had not been touched for decades. Olivia's keen eyes scanned each brownish-brown photo covered in time doctors with stern faces, nurses in crisply starched uniforms, rows of cold iron beds lined up in old treatment areas. But then, one photo made her freeze. In the photograph, a young nurse about 25 years old sat upright on a wooden chair. Her face calm, her eyes gentle and professional. In her arms was a baby wrapped in a delicate silver-embroidered ceremonial cloth. The baby slept peacefully, its face serene, its eyes closed as if in a dream. On the back of the photograph, in elegant slanted handwriting, it read, "Margaret Howard, head nurse of the pediatric ward with baby Elizabeth Stone, April 18, 1904. Olivia frowned slightly. Something was wrong. The serenity on the nurse's face was too absolute. And the baby, it seemed like he wasn't just sleeping. She took out a small magnifying glass and examined the photograph closely. The baby's skin was unusually cold, its features were stiff. Its small hands were folded neatly. Impossibly perfect. Dr. Bennett. She called, her voice trembling slightly. "Could you help me look at this?" Mr. Bennett, the chairman of the hospital's history committee, stepped forward, adjusted his glasses, looked closely, and nodded slightly. "Post-mortem photo," he said slowly. "The baby died before the photo was taken." Olivia was stunned. "But why is the nurse holding it? Not the parents." "That's what's strange," Bennett replied. "Usually post-mortem photos are taken with the family. A nurse holding a deceased patient? Maybe it's a documentary photo, or there's some other connection we don't understand." She carefully placed the photo in its protective plastic cover, a series of questions already running through her mind. Who was Elizabeth Stone? Why was she in the nurse's arms in her final moments, and not in her parents' arms? From that moment, Olivia knew she couldn't stop. She went down to the basement, where the hospital's oldest records were kept in cold storage. Their thick, dusty files from 1904 revealed an old story. Margaret Howard had been head nurse of the pediatric ward from 1901 to 1927, renowned for her dedication and extraordinary skill in caring for dying children. But the most precious gift Olivia found was a leather notebook handwritten, donated by Margaret's granddaughter after her death in 1952. Inside, in neat, slanted handwriting, it was a diary from 1904. The first pages described the harsh life in the hospital. At that time, long shifts, primitive conditions, and helplessness in the face of the epidemic that claimed hundreds of young lives. Then, on March 12, 1904, Olivia read the first line that mentioned a name. The little girl brought in today, abandoned on the church steps, severely malnourished, breathing difficult, about 6 months old. No identification, only a silver cross hanging on a ribbon, and a tattered blanket embroidered with the name Elizabeth. We've named her Stone because she was found by the stone baptismal font. Prognosis? Unknown. The next lines made Olivia's heart clench. March 20. Elizabeth is improving. Her little hand held mine for almost an hour without letting go. The apprentice doctor advised me not to get too attached. But how could I not be moved by such a tiny creature? March 27. His breathing was getting heavier. I brought a chair to the crib and stayed up all night. Some nurses said I was unprofessional, but I couldn't bear the thought of him struggling alone in the dark. At the bottom of the page, the ink had faded slightly, as if tears had fallen there. Olivia ran her finger over the old writing, and for a moment, she felt as if someone was standing right behind her, silent, looking at the photograph still in its protective glass. The journal entry dated April 17, 1904, brought tears to Olivia's eyes. The ink was faint, the lines unsteady, as though written by trembling hands. We lost our Elizabeth this morning at 3:17. I was holding her when she took her final breath. So gentle, it was like watching a candle's flame flicker out. No family has come forward despite the notices in the papers. Tomorrow, hospital protocol requires her to be photographed for medical records before burial in the city cemetery. I have asked to hold her for this photograph. Dr. Apprentice has agreed. He understands. In these 6 weeks, I became the only mother Elizabeth ever knew. Olivia sat very still. The journal lay open in her lap, the photograph resting beside it. What had once seemed like a sterile record of hospital procedure now revealed itself as something achingly human. The quiet defiance of a nurse who refused to let an abandoned child slip into oblivion. Seeking a deeper understanding, Olivia arranged to meet Dr. Eleanor Fisher, a medical historian specializing in early pediatric care. They met in the hospital library, the 1904 photograph placed between them on a polished oak table. Post-mortem photography was still common practice in the early 20th century. Dr. Fisher explained examining the image through white archival gloves. But this example is remarkable. It isn't a family memorial, it's institutional. That changes everything. Would it have been unusual, Olivia asked softly, for a nurse to pose with a deceased patient? Extremely, Fisher replied. These photographs were almost always family tributes, parents holding their lost children, siblings beside siblings. They were deeply personal mementos from an age when infant mortality was heartbreakingly frequent. But this image, she paused. This one feels different. It's not clinical, It's intimate. She unfolded a portfolio of other post-mortem portraits. Notice the difference, Fisher said. Family portraits often tried to imitate live children, posed as if sleeping, sometimes surrounded by their favorite toys. This one, however, bears the restraint of formality, yet still radiates immense tenderness. Olivia nodded slowly. Margaret's journal said she became deeply attached to Elizabeth. Fisher smiled faintly. Then, that explains it. This photograph bridges two worlds, the professional and the personal. When a child is abandoned, hospital staff sometimes form bonds that are deeper than anyone realizes. In a sense, they become the child's only family. She leaned closer, pointing to subtle details in the image. The christening gown, see how fine the embroidery is, far beyond hospital issue. The small silver cross around the infant's neck, and the way Margaret cradles her, not with rigidity, but with practiced tenderness. Her journal mentioned that the cross was found with Elizabeth Olivia. Whispered. Fisher's voice softened. That's significant. In that era, abandoned infants were sometimes left with a single valuable item, something to show they were loved even if they could not be kept. The cross means her mother wanted her to be remembered, not as an orphan, but as someone's beloved child. As their conversation drew to a close, Fisher offered one final reflection. What makes this photograph extraordinary isn't merely its documentation of an old practice. It's how it captures something eternal that the bond between a caregiver and a child can form swiftly, deeply, and last beyond death itself. Later that night, Olivia returned to the archives. She needed to know more about Elizabeth's brief life and the world that had failed her. Most of the hospital's early records had been lost in a storage fire in the 1930s. But the children's ward admission ledger had survived, its pages browned and brittle. There, beneath fading ink, she found the entry. Infant female, approximately 6 months old. Admitted March 12, 1904. Diagnosis: severe malnourishment, respiratory infection, suspected tuberculosis. Guardian: State Orphanage Authority. Attending physician: Dr. Walter Apprentice. Primary nurse: Margaret Howard. Her final search led her to the city archives, where she located the death certificate filed under Stone Elizabeth. Infant. Cause of death: consumption and failure to thrive. Parents unknown. Olivia stared at the faded paper, at the hollow space where names should have been. Only one person had ever held that child, whispered her name, and made sure she was remembered, if only in a single silent photograph. A moment small enough to be forgotten by time, yet powerful enough to outlive it. The informant was listed as Margaret Howard, head nurse. The burial location: City Cemetery, Section 8, infants. With Dr. Bennett's help, Olivia began to interpret the old medical terms through a modern lens. What they once called consumption was, in truth, pulmonary tuberculosis, a disease that swept mercilessly through hospitals in that era, claiming the smallest and weakest first. For malnourished infants, it was almost always fatal. There were no antibiotics, then only comfort care. The quiet work of nurses doing what little they could to ease a child's suffering. Among the surviving records, one document stood out: a monthly report from Dr. Apprentice to the hospital board, preserved miraculously in the administrative archives. We continue to see abandoned infants at an alarming rate. It read, many showing signs of severe neglect. Of particular note is the case of baby Elizabeth Stone, admitted in March, and deceased in April. This case demonstrates both the limitations of our medical capabilities and the exemplary dedication of our nursing staff. The report went on to mention that head nurse Howard had provided extraordinary care, often staying with the infant during off-duty hours, ensuring dignified treatment through the child's final moments. Though I have cautioned staff against forming personal attachments, Dr. Apprentice wrote, I cannot fault the quality of care such dedication produced. A memorial photograph of the baby, he noted, had been preserved in the records, an example of professional compassion in terminal cases. In the hospital's financial ledger, Olivia found another detail, one small but deeply human. April 19, 1904. Disbursement to M. Howard for reimbursement of burial expenses for indigent patient E. Stone, 475. It was a significant sum for a nurse's salary in 1904. Enough to suggest that Margaret had paid from her own pocket, perhaps arranging something gentler than the anonymous city intimate meant for unclaimed infants. As Olivia pieced together the fragments, the outlines of a relationship began to form: an abandoned infant gravely ill, and a nurse whose devotion went far beyond duty. The photograph, she realized, was not a mere clinical record. It was a testament, a memorial created by someone determined that Elizabeth's brief, fragile life would not disappear unnoticed. Through persistent research, Olivia uncovered another thread: the name of the hospital's contracted photographer between 1900 and 1910, James Sullivan. Sullivan had long passed in 1936, but his business records were preserved by the Boston Historical Photography Society. In his appointment book under April 18, 1904 was a brief note: Children's Hospital, 10 Zooner AM. Memorial portrait: deceased infant with nurse Howard. Special considerations noted. Even more revealing were Sullivan's technical notes, a quiet archive of human tenderness behind the camera. Under a section titled Memorial Portraits, he had written, "Hospital memorials require particular sensitivity, especially with infant subjects. For the Stone infant, April 18th, Nurse Howard requested natural light, only no visible supports, no mechanical positioning. The child was to be photographed in her arms rather than in the standard repose position. This, Sullivan noted, required longer exposure time. Seconds of stillness that must have felt like an eternity for a grieving nurse. Margaret had brought her own white christening clothes, and she insisted on washing and dressing, the child herself refusing the mortuary's touch. She asked for 2 copies, one for the hospital, one for herself. Unusual, he wrote, but understandable. There was no family to claim the child. A note for future institutional memorials. The tenderness in Nurse Howard's approach produced a superior result. Less clinical, more human. Consider similar approaches where appropriate. Among Sullivan's surviving correspondence, Olivia found a note from Dr. Apprentice authorizing payment for those 2 prints, one for the record and one for Nurse Howard's keeping. Then a letter in Margaret's own hand. Thank you for your dignified and gentle handling of our Elizabeth's memorial portrait. The photographer's final annotation revealed the quiet impact of that day. Of all the post-mortem portraits I have taken, this stands among the most affecting. The nurse held the child not as a professional, but as a mother might hold her sleeping daughter. Some bonds transcend the expected, reminding us that family is sometimes found rather than born. By the time Olivia finished reading, she was no longer simply studying a historical image. She was bearing witness to something profoundly human love expressed not in life, but in remembrance. And perhaps she wondered softly, as we all must in the end, who decides which moments deserve to be remembered. The portrait Olivia realized was revealing itself to be far more than a record of loss. It was evidence delicate but undeniable of a bond formed in the most fragile of circumstances. Between an abandoned infant who had no one left in the world and a nurse who refused to let her disappear into the silence. Margaret's journal had mentioned one small detail, something easily overlooked in earlier readings: a silver cross found with baby Elizabeth on the day she was abandoned. It was simple, she had written but carefully made, and suddenly Olivia wondered, could it still exist? That question led her to a quiet corner of the hospital's administrative building, where a small museum preserved fragments of its long and complicated past. Old medical instruments, faded photographs, letters written in looping script. The museum felt like a space where memories had learned to whisper. The curator, Dr. Sarah Chen, listened politely as Olivia explained her search. She hesitated before answering. Small personal items from patients rarely survived, she said gently, especially from indigent cases. They weren't considered part of the medical record. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, however, we do have a collection donated by Margaret Howard's family after her death. Let me check the inventory. Moments later, she returned carrying a small velvet box. Inside lay a tarnished silver cross attached to a faded ribbon. A handwritten note, yellowed but steady, was tucked beneath it. Elizabeth Stone's cross, found with her at abandonment, March 1904. Kept in her memory. M. Howard. The cross was finely crafted, its edges engraved with a delicate floral pattern. Not expensive, but made with care. The kind of thing a mother would leave when she had nothing else to give. When Dr. Chen turned it over, a faint inscription caught the light. With love always. For a long time, neither woman spoke. Olivia was the first to whisper, someone cared enough to leave this with her. Dr. Chen nodded. In the early 1900s, leaving a child was an act of desperation, not neglect. Sometimes, the only way a mother could protect her child was by letting go. Margaret's own journal, still preserved in the archives, told what happened next. April 30th, 1904. I wear Elizabeth's silver cross inside my uniform while on duty. It feels important to carry a small piece of her with me as I care for other children. Dr. Apprentice says I should return to regular duties, but I find peace in the ward where the little ones need the most presence. May 15th, 1904. Visited Elizabeth's grave today. Her marker shows only her name and dates, but I remember who she was, how she gripped my finger, how her eyes searched for me. I placed wildflowers on the grave and promised to return. Her cross hangs now beside my bed when I sleep. Olivia read in silence, her breath slowing as the story deepened. Margaret had continued visiting the grave every month for years. Over time, she even established a small fund to provide proper burial clothes for other abandoned infants. She had turned her grief into purpose. Dr. Chen, watching as Olivia gently returned the cross to its case, spoke softly. This wasn't just about one child, she said. Elizabeth changed her. That cross isn't just a keepsake, it's the symbol of how one small life reshaped an entire career. Margaret's silver cross had been preserved for nearly 50 years, kept safe until her own death in 1952. It stood as quiet proof that love had found a way to survive where the world expected none. With Elizabeth's death certificate in hand, Olivia's next step felt inevitable. She went to the old city cemetery, Section 8. The children's section lay beneath the wide arms of ancient oak trees. Many stones were cracked, others eroded until the names were ghosts of letters. When Olivia approached the caretaker's office, an older man named Joseph greeted her kindly. He had tended the grounds for decades. The children's section, he told her, has stories not many know. Most of those little ones were buried without names, just numbers. But there was a nurse from the children's hospital who changed that. She made sure at least some of them were remembered. Joseph led her through rows of tiny graves until they reached one small, well-tended stone. Its carving was simple, but the words were hauntingly clear. Elizabeth Stone, unknown in life, beloved in death. 1903-1904. Unlike the others, this grave had been cared for. We'd free the stone still clean. Joseph explained quietly. This plot was purchased privately, not through the city's indigent fund. And here's something unusual. There's a perpetual care endowment set up in 1952. Olivia looked up sharply. 1952? That's the year Margaret Howard died. Joseph nodded. She must have arranged it herself, he said softly. Even after she was gone, she wanted that little one to never be forgotten. And in that quiet corner of the cemetery beneath the sighing trees, Olivia finally understood. What began as a single faded photograph had revealed something timeless. A story not of death, but of devotion that refused to fade. The original notation in the records was unmistakable. Margaret Howard, nurse purchaser. As Olivia read further, her breath caught. Margaret had not done this just once. Between 1904 and 1927, she had purchased grave markers for dozens of children buried in that same quiet corner of the city cemetery. Walking slowly among the rows, Olivia began to see a pattern. Simple stones, small names. Annie, Samuel, Grace, each engraved with care, each belonging to a child who had died without family to claim them. And yet every one of them bore the same quiet dignity, as if someone had refused to let their stories fade into the unmarked earth. Joseph, the caretaker, thumbed through the oldest of the cemetery ledgers. He stopped at one entry, his weathered finger tracing the line. When Nurse Howard died in 1952, he murmured. Her will stated she wished to be buried here, in the children's section. He led Olivia a few paces farther. There it was. A modest stone marked Margaret Howard, 1879-1952, faithful nurse and guardian. Olivia stood in silence, her voice barely above a whisper. She chose to rest beside the children she cared for, instead of her own family. Joseph nodded gently. It happens more than you'd think, he said. People form bonds that go beyond blood. In 50 years here, I've seen how death reveals the truth about who mattered most to whom. Before leaving, Olivia laid fresh flowers on both graves, the nurse and the infant she had refused to let vanish into anonymity. Side by side, their markers seemed to speak of a promise that had outlived both life and time. When Olivia returned to her work, the hospital was preparing for its upcoming anniversary exhibition. She proposed including the 1904 photograph, the one that had started it all. But her suggestion quickly stirred debate. Dr. Paul Winters, the committee chairman, frowned. Displaying post-mortem photography might be upsetting to visitors, he cautioned. People today aren't accustomed to such images. It could seem morbid. Olivia met his concern with quiet conviction. That's precisely why it matters, she said. The image isn't about death, it's about compassion. It reminds us how people in the past faced loss openly, tenderly, and how care sometimes extended beyond life itself. Dr. Bennett, who had supported her research from the beginning, added softly, "To erase such moments from history would be to erase the humanity that once filled these hospital halls." Infant mortality was part of daily life in 1904. Understanding how nurses and doctors navigated those losses helps us remember how far medicine and empathy have come. The conversation deepened, touching on ethics and emotion alike. Could the photograph of a deceased infant over a century old be displayed publicly? Dr. Maya Singh, the hospital's ethics consultant, offered clarity. The question, she said, isn't whether the image depicts death, but whether it does so with dignity. This photograph tells a story of devotion, not morbidity. It's an educational artifact, one that honors the nurse and the child she refused to forget. After weeks of discussion, a decision was reached. The photograph would be shown, but with care. It would be displayed alongside thoughtful context, explanations of early 20th century memorial practices, notes on infant care in that era, and a gentle warning for visitors who might wish to skip the section. Most importantly, the focus would not be on the loss itself, but on the love that had persisted through it. Olivia spent long nights crafting the exhibition text, wanting every word to carry the quiet weight the story deserved. Her final label read, "At first glance, this 1904 portrait appears to show a nurse holding a sleeping child. Closer examination reveals it to be a post-mortem photograph, a common memorial practice in an era when infant mortality was heartbreakingly frequent. Nurse Margaret Howard cradles baby Elizabeth Stone, an abandoned infant she cared for during the final 6 weeks of her life. Unlike most post-mortem portraits taken with family, this one depicts a bond born within the walls of a hospital. Margaret became Elizabeth's surrogate mother, sitting through nights of labored breathing, buying her burial clothes, and ensuring the child who had entered life unloved would not leave it unmourned. In this image, we see not just death, but dignity, compassion, and the enduring proof that care can outlast even a heartbeat. As she finished her work, Olivia felt that same quiet stillness she had sensed in the cemetery, the sense that some stories once found never truly end. They simply wait for someone to listen. The photograph, once a simple artifact of medical history, now invites us to linger, to imagine how caregivers long ago balanced duty and tenderness, science and soul. How did they see the fragile line between care and affection, between the living and the nearly gone? When Nurse Margaret Howard chose to be photographed with little Elizabeth, she unknowingly transformed a clinical act into something almost sacred, an image of compassion made eternal. In that moment, the boundaries of medicine softened and love quietly took its place beside death. As Olivia curated the hospital's anniversary exhibition, she realized the photograph had grown far beyond its archival purpose. It had become a mirror, reflecting not only a child's final hours, but the timeless truth that even in sterile wards and fading breaths, human connection remains the purest form of healing. In her later research, Olivia discovered how deeply Elizabeth's passing shaped Margaret's life. After 1904, The nurse had chosen to work exclusively in the terminal ward, tending to children whose recovery was no longer possible. Her supervisor, Dr. Apprentice, wrote in his notes, "Her ability to bring peace to dying children is extraordinary. My concern lies only in how much of herself she gives away." Margaret's methods soon changed the hospital itself. By 1915, her own guidelines for pediatric end-of-life care were officially adopted. She wrote, "When medicine can no longer cure, our duty transforms from saving life to safeguarding comfort. A child should never die in fear or alone. The nurse's hands must remain steady, but her heart open." Letters from grieving parents began to arrive. One mother in 1921 wrote simply, "When our Sarah's illness took her, we could not bear to stay. But knowing Nurse Howard held her hand until the end brought us peace we did not think possible." Decades later, Olivia interviewed elderly nurses who had once trained under Margaret's watchful eye. 97-year-old Clara Wilson recalled, "She taught us that presence mattered as much as any procedure." We all knew the story of baby Elizabeth. She'd tell new nurses, "Remember, every child is someone's Elizabeth, whether that someone is here or not." Among the staff, Margaret became something of a legend, exacting in her standards, yet fiercely devoted to gentleness. She introduced rituals of remembrance, ensuring that even children without families were buried with names, songs, and care. Before her, such tenderness had no place in medical manuals. After her, it became practice. By her retirement in 1947, Margaret's teachings had quietly foreshadowed what we now know as hospice and palliative care decades before the world gave those ideas a name. On the hospital's 150th anniversary, Olivia stood beneath soft light beside the restored 1904 photograph. Around it rested Margaret's worn journal, the little silver cross she once wore, and two gravestone photographs, Margaret's and Elizabeth's. Visitors came in silence, nurses, doctors, historians, and among them a frail woman who introduced herself as Patricia Howard Collins, Margaret's great-niece. "Aunt Margaret never married," she said. "But she always told us she had children, all the ones she cared for." This photograph hung in her room all her life. I once asked her who the baby was. She said, "That's Elizabeth," and she smiled. Patricia's gift to the archive included Margaret's poems, her handwritten letters, and a small embroidered handkerchief stitched with the letter E. As the evening wore on, Olivia noticed how people lingered by that single image. What once seemed unsettling had become deeply moving, a portrait of care that refused to end where life did. Dr. Bennett, the curator's mentor, joined her quietly. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "You've shown us that this isn't just a photograph of death. It's a portrait of devotion care that endured beyond mortality." Olivia nodded. Margaret refused to let Elizabeth be forgotten. In doing so, she taught us that true caregiving isn't about defeating death, but about accompanying life until its final breath. As the lights dimmed and the gallery emptied, Olivia turned once more toward the photograph. The serene nurse, the still child. What once evoked sorrow now radiated a calm truth that the deepest purpose of medicine is not just to heal the body, but to honor the soul within it. Even across the quiet threshold of death, compassion endures. And perhaps, as this story reminds us, that is the kind of care that never truly fades.